Imagine you are scrolling through your news feed right now. You see a headline from a credible outlet reporting that a man in a local hospital was verifiably resurrected from the dead. What is your immediate reaction?
I mean, your brain probably looks for the trick right away.
Right. You start assuming there must be a medical error or a misdiagnosis or maybe some undiscovered scientific explanation. Why is that? Why is my modern default setting immediate skepticism toward the supernatural?
Well, it is because about 500 years ago, a specific group of philosophers completely rewired the operating system of the human mind.
And that is what we are tracking today. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, you and I are going to trace the specific philosophical dominoes that fell between the 1300s and the 1800s.
We are tracking the precise intellectual shifts that set the stage for contemporary religious liberalism and modern skepticism.
To build this case, we are pulling from a rigorous stack of sources. Our primary text is Paul Enns and his work in the Moody Handbook of Theology, revised and expanded.
Yes, specifically his introduction to contemporary theology in that volume.
We are also bringing in the broader scholarly tracking done by figures he cites, thinkers like Karl Barth, Bernard Ramm, and John D. Woodbridge, who track these historical shifts. To set the stage for you, think about human intellectual history like a massive solar system.
Oh, that is a good way to picture it.
Yeah, for centuries, divine revelation was the sun. It sat at the absolute center, and human thought, culture, and science all orbited around it. Today, we are tracking the moments humanity collectively decided to swap out the sun.
Taking divine revelation out of the center and placing autonomous human reason right in the middle.
Precisely. We are not treating this like a typical podcast episode, but rather a custom-tailored deep dive into these historical shifts.
That solar system analogy gives us the perfect framework for the sheer scale of the shift we are tracking.
So where do we start? What is the first domino?
The first major movement in this restructuring of the intellectual universe is the Renaissance.
The word itself means new birth, right?
Yeah, new birth. Historians generally date this era from around 1350 to 1650. The core shift here is a massive change in how human beings viewed their place in the world.
And to really grasp the size of this, you have to look at the medieval mindset that came before it.
Absolutely. During the Middle Ages, society operated on a very corporate religious approach to life.
What does that mean for the average person back then?
Well, people understood themselves primarily as parts of a larger whole. You were a member of a church or a village or a guild. You were not really an isolated individual in the modern sense.
Right.
The overarching canopy of life was a divine order. Truth was something handed down from God through established authorities, and you simply received it.
And the Renaissance substituted that medieval framework for a secular, individualistic view of life.
Yeah, the focus moved away from the glory of God and settled firmly upon the glory of man.
You can actually see this in the art of the period.
Oh, for sure. Think about moving from the flat, symbolic religious icons of the Middle Ages.
Right, the ones where the saints have those golden halos and look almost two-dimensional.
Exactly. Moving from that to hyper-realistic, anatomically perfect statues like Michelangelo's David. It is a visual representation of the philosophical shift.
The interest shifted away from heaven, locking instead onto the material world and what human beings could achieve right here, right now.
And with this intense new focus, reliance upon human reason began to supersede reliance upon divine revelation.
If you crown human reason as the ultimate authority, you naturally get a rising tide of skepticism concerning the Bible and the supernatural.
Right. We see thinkers entering the scene like René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
So what was their main argument?
They argued with immense confidence that human reason and the emerging scientific method were entirely sufficient to comprehend the riddles of life.
And by doing this, their philosophy laid the ground floor for what would later become religious liberalism. Secular humanists basically built the foundations by systematically denying supernaturalism.
They did. When you shift focus to the individual, objective external revelation is naturally subjected to personal internal scrutiny.
I think we need to clarify something here, though. Did these philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, did they actively set out to destroy orthodox religion?
That is a really common misconception.
Right, because it is easy to look back and think they were a bunch of atheists trying to tear down the church.
But they were not. Many of them did not view themselves as destroyers of religion at all.
So it was more a case where their soaring confidence in human capability just naturally crowded out the need for the supernatural.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it. Descartes, for example, considered himself a devout Catholic. He actually tried to construct a rational proof for the existence of God.
Wait, really? He tried to prove God with this new system.
He did. However, by making human reason the supreme judge and jury of what is real, they inadvertently changed the standard of truth.
When the focus shifts to the individual mind, objective, external revelation from God is suddenly forced to submit to personal, internal scrutiny.
Right. The individual now demands that truth meet their personal standard of rational proof.
If someone builds a machine they believe can answer every question in the universe, they might not actively hate the old methods of finding answers.
They just render them obsolete.
I ask this because this 14th century shift still dictates how you, the listener, interact with information today.
It absolutely does.
We are hardwired by this specific era to trust the human mind above all else. We demand material explanations because these men convince the world that the human mind is capable of solving every mystery.
Without needing a voice from heaven to intervene.
But once the Renaissance established human reason as the undisputed king of the universe, the subsequent era had to tackle a massive logistical problem.
Which is?
If human reason is the king, how does that king actually acquire knowledge?
That is the pivotal question. Answering that helps explain what happened next in the timeline.
This leads us directly into the Age of Enlightenment.
Yes. The mechanics of acquiring knowledge take center stage here. The central figure of this era is the English philosopher John Locke.
He lived from 1632 to 1704, right?
That is correct. Locke introduced a concept known as empiricism, or subjectivism. He taught that knowledge comes exclusively from experience.
So how does that actually work in practice?
Locke argued for a strict two-step process for acquiring knowledge. Step 1 involves sensations.
Sensations, meaning the physical senses.
Yeah, this is the physical process where a person becomes aware of external surroundings through the 5 physical senses.
So you see an apple, you touch its smooth skin, you taste its sweetness.
Exactly. Then step 2 involves reflections.
And reflections are internal.
Right. This is the internal process where the mind contemplates the meaning of those physical sensations. It categorizes them and forms the abstract idea of an apple.
Locke's grand thesis was that the human mind at birth is a blank slate.
The tabula rasa.
Right. He argued nothing exists in the mind that is not first in the senses.
And while Locke did try to maintain some room for God, his system had a massive catch.
He firmly rejected any tenets of the Christian faith that contradicted experimental reason.
Which is a huge problem for Orthodox theology. This experiential requirement built the underpinnings of theological liberalism and neo-orthodoxy.
Because it demanded that all truth, even divine truth, pass through the checkpoint of human sensory experience.
Yes.
We need to pause and unpack the practical reality of Locke's view here, because applying this strictly seems to break down when we look at the full scope of human experience.
How so?
Well, if knowledge absolutely requires physical sensation as its starting point, what happens to concepts that have no physical properties whatsoever?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Think about justice or love or the divine. You cannot touch justice. You cannot smell love.
You certainly cannot put God in a test tube and observe him with a microscope.
Trying to validate spiritual or moral realities using only sensory experience is like trying to measure the weight of an idea using a grocery store produce scale.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the flaw in Locke's system.
You are using the wrong tool for the job. A physical scale is fantastic for weighing a bag of apples, but it is entirely useless for weighing the concept of human rights.
When you place justice on that physical scale, the scale registers 0.
So by demanding that all knowledge originate from the 5 senses, Locke is essentially declaring that anything the produce scale cannot weigh does not actually exist.
Or at least cannot be known as objective truth. Locke's method forces spiritual and theological concepts to pass through a physical checkpoint.
Which inherently disadvantages any claim of divine revelation.
Right. Because Locke made experimental reason the ultimate judge of reality, anything miraculous was immediately placed on trial.
If a miracle, by definition, defies the normal sensory experiences of the natural laws, Locke's system struggles to accept it.
Even though Locke himself tried to maintain a space for Christianity, the philosophical filter he built caught and discarded the supernatural.
Scholars like Bernard Rahm have pointed out how this specific rationalistic filter forced later theologians into a corner.
Think about what we call neo-orthodoxy, which emerged much later with figures like Karl Barth.
Barth was trying to respond to this, right?
Yeah, neo-orthodoxy was, in many ways, an attempt to bypass this rationalistic filter. It suggested that revelation is not objective historical data you can weigh on Locke's scale.
So what did they say it was?
They said it was a subjective existential encounter with God.
But the root problem remains.
It does. Once you concede that the human mind and its sensory inputs are the ultimate arbiters of truth, you lose the ability to claim that an infinite God has spoken objectively into human history.
In a way that is binding on everyone.
Right.
If Locke demanded physical sensation for knowledge, the thinkers who followed him took that rule and pushed it to an astonishing reality-bending extreme.
This is where things get really wild.
We move next to George Berkeley, who lived from 1685 to 1753, and David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776.
Let us start with Berkeley. He took Locke's focus on the senses and formulated a principle that sounds like a riddle.
To be is to be perceived.
That is the one. He argued that things are precisely what they are experienced to be. The experienced qualities make up the total essence of the object.
So according to Berkeley, all knowledge exists strictly in the mind.
Yes.
I liken Berkeley's philosophy to the classic thought experiment about the tree falling in the forest.
If a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Exactly. Berkeley is arguing that without a perceiving mind, the tree's sound, and in fact the tree itself, lacks essence.
He pushes the focus on human perception so far that the material world almost evaporates into pure mental experience.
Which seems crazy. Why would anyone push it that far?
Well, the tragic irony of George Berkeley is one of the most fascinating developments in this entire intellectual progression.
Because of who he was?
Right. Berkeley was an Anglican bishop. He actually developed this highly unusual sense-oriented system as an apologetic.
Wait, he was trying to defend the faith with this?
Yes. He was trying to defend belief in God against the rising tide of secular materialism.
How does saying to be is to be perceived defend God?
Berkeley argued that since things only exist when they are perceived, and since the material world obviously continues to exist even when no human is looking at it, there must be an ultimate infinite mind who is constantly perceiving everything.
And that infinite mind is God.
Exactly. He tried to defend God using human experience, but the practical result was catastrophic for Orthodox theology.
Why? What went wrong?
By arguing that all knowledge exists strictly in the mind and that things are only what we experience them to be, he accidentally created an anti-supernatural framework.
He exalted human reason and experience to such heights that he inadvertently denied the validity of special, objective divine revelation.
He made the human mind the absolute boundary of reality.
And then comes David Hume,
the Scottish skeptic.
Hume looked at Berkeley's locked door of mental perception, threw away the key, and ushered in an era of pure skepticism.
Hume carried the ideas of Locke and Berkeley to their ruthless logical conclusion.
If all we have are our subjective sensory impressions, Hume argued, then we cannot actually prove anything beyond those impressions.
We cannot even prove cause and effect.
Wait, really? Not even cause and effect?
No. Hume used the example of billiard balls. If you see one billiard ball hit another, you only perceive the sequence of events.
You see ball A hit ball B.
Right, but you do not see the invisible force causing the second ball to move. You just see the sequence.
So Hume famously attacked the miracles of the Bible.
He asserted that no amount of human testimony could ever outweigh the uniform experience of natural laws.
He denied the possibility of knowing objective truth altogether.
And the Age of Enlightenment, peaking with Hume, brought widespread agnosticism. It cemented the scientific method as the sole acceptable basis for proving truth.
I want to point out to you, the listener, that the ghost of David Hume is still haunting our modern culture.
Oh, heavily.
Notice how often people demand strict, scientific, empirical proof for any spiritual claim. If you bring up a claim about God, the immediate cultural response is, show me the data.
Show me the peer-reviewed study. Prove it in a lab.
That reflexive demand is a direct inheritance from David Hume. We have completely internalized his conclusion that if something cannot be empirically measured, it cannot be considered objective truth.
But with empiricism dismantling traditional belief in the supernatural, society was left with a terrifying void.
Because human beings still had an innate sense of morality. They still felt a psychological need for spirituality.
But the philosophers had just destroyed the intellectual permission to believe in a supernatural God who reveals himself.
Hume's skepticism caused an existential crisis for Western civilization.
A new philosophical system had to emerge to try and salvage the spiritual realm.
But it had to be rebuilt strictly on human terms, staying within the boundaries the Enlightenment had drawn.
Which leads us to idealism.
Idealism, was the philosophical movement that declared reality does not lie in the physical, material realm, but rather in the mind.
The basic premise is that behind all reality is a divine mind, moving the world toward good.
And the pivotal figure who constructed this new framework was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. He looked at the massive void left behind by Hume's skepticism and tried to rescue human knowledge and morality.
He realized that if Hume was right, civilization would collapse into moral anarchy.
Exactly. So Kant insisted that one's concept of God must come strictly from reason.
Consequently, Kant attacked all the traditional historical proofs for the existence of God, denying their validity entirely.
According to Kant, knowledge cannot exist apart from experience that can be proven through rigorous testing.
In doing this, Kant achieved a massive philosophical synthesis. He combined rationalism, which relies on human reason, with empiricism, which relies on the scientific method.
Because he restricted true knowledge to what can be tested and experienced, Kant left absolutely no room for the supernatural intervention of God in history.
And because of this highly restrictive focus, scholars frequently identify Kant as the theoretical founder of religious liberalism.
Yes. If you cannot have a supernatural God who intervenes, performs miracles, and reveals truth objectively, you have to redefine the core figure of the Christian faith.
For Kant, Jesus could no longer be the incarnate Son of God performing miracles and rising from the dead.
Instead, Jesus was reduced to being a good teacher who modeled a high ethical ideal.
Liberal theology seized upon Kant's premise and built an entire paradigm asserting that Christianity is fundamentally an ethical system governing human behavior,
rather than a supernatural revelation from the Creator.
This shift Kant makes is staggering. If you strip the miraculous out of Christianity and you remove the divine incarnation, the resurrection, and supernatural intervention, and all you leave behind is a system of ethics, do you even have Christianity anymore?
A lot of Orthodox thinkers would say no.
Or do you just have a 19th century self-help program dressed up in religious terminology?
That is a harsh but accurate way to frame it.
If Jesus is simply a good teacher with a high ethical ideal, then he's no different than Socrates or Confucius.
Right.
The entire historical weight of the Christian faith is built on the claim that something supernatural actually happened in real time and space.
Kant's maneuver reduces religion entirely to moral behavior.
He takes the vertical relationship between God and humanity and flattens it into a horizontal rulebook for how humans should treat one another.
We see this today in what sociologists call moralistic therapeutic deism.
What is that?
It is the idea that God just wants you to be a nice person and be happy, but he does not actually intrude on your life.
Wow, that is Kant's legacy right there.
It really is. You hit the nail on the head regarding the critique Orthodox theologians levy against Kant's system. When you remove the supernatural, the resulting religion is powerless to save.
It can only instruct.
This flattening of theology paved the way for George W.F. Hegel.
Hegel. He lived from 1770 to 1831.
Hegel took the concept of idealism to its absolute maximum. He taught that only the mind is real and everything else is just an expression of the mind.
For Hegel, all reality is an expression of what he called the absolute,
which is his term for God. He summarized this view with his famous motto, "The real is rational and the rational is real."
But Hegel is most famous for his concept of the dialectic.
Yes. The dialectic was his explanation for how God, or the absolute, is at work in history.
How does the dialectic operate?
It operates in a three-step rhythm. First, you have a thesis.
A thesis being an established idea or state of affairs.
Right. This thesis inevitably gives rise to its opposite, an antithesis.
So you have idea A, and then idea B comes along to oppose it.
Exactly. The conflict between the thesis and the antithesis results in a synthesis.
A blending of the two diverse concepts into a higher, more evolved truth.
The crucial element of Hegel's system is that this process is unending.
Unending, so it never stops.
The moment the new synthesis is established, it immediately becomes the new thesis. It generates its own antithesis, and the cycle continues forever.
I often compare the Hegelian dialectic to a giant philosophical blender.
A blender.
Yeah. You put two opposing contradictory ideas into the pitcher, you hit the Zen button, and you get a brand new intellectual smoothie.
I like that.
That is your synthesis. But instead of pouring it out and drinking it, you immediately toss a new opposing ingredient into the blender and hit the button again. And you do this forever.
The blades never stop spinning.
The recipe is never finished. Under Hegel's system, nothing is ever final and nothing is ever absolute.
The theological casualties of Hegel's method were staggering.
Because truth is constantly evolving through this dialectic.
Hegel did not view Christianity as a revealed, final religion. Instead, he saw it simply as a synthesis of developing culture that was actively evolving into something else.
Certifically evolving into speculative philosophy.
To Hegel, Christian doctrines were not concrete truths. Terms like the Son of God were not to be understood in a literal historical sense.
They were only symbolic.
Paul Enns links Hegel's methodology directly to the rise of higher critical methods in theology.
Like the documentary hypothesis.
Yes, the documentary hypothesis severely questioned the traditional, historically held authorship of the first 5 books of Scripture.
And that is intensely rooted in Hegelian thought.
Instead of accepting that God revealed the law to Moses, higher critics applied the dialectic. They argued that the biblical text must be a patchwork synthesis of evolving tribal religions over centuries.
I want you to clarify the stakes here for the listener.
Okay.
If truth is constantly evolving through this endless dialectic, if yesterday's absolute truth is just raw material for tomorrow's synthesis, how can a person trust historical texts?
Or any truth claim, for that matter.
Right. How can they trust it to be objectively real? If the meaning of the biblical text is constantly shifting based on the current cultural synthesis, the text itself seems to lose all its authority.
The stakes are incredibly high, and you have identified the exact crisis that Hegelian thought created for modern theology.
It is a massive crisis.
If truth is a moving target that constantly evolves through the dialectic, then no historical text can possess objective, lasting authority.
A text like the Bible becomes a historical artifact.
A snapshot of a previous synthesis, rather than a living, authoritative voice.
If doctrines are just symbols that change meaning as human philosophy advances, then the individual believer has no solid ground to stand on.
You cannot trust a promise in the text if the concept of that promise is scheduled to evolve into its opposite a generation later.
Hegel's system turns all theology into sociology and history.
It assumes that humanity is always progressing upward, becoming more rational, and therefore outgrowing the literal supernatural beliefs of the past.
When liberal theology built extensively on the foundations of Kant and Hegel, it fully adopted this evolutionary view of truth.
The Bible was no longer viewed as God speaking to man. It was seen simply as a record of man's evolving thoughts about God.
Which explains the rise of higher criticism.
Treating the scriptures as purely human documents to be dissected, rather than divine revelation to be obeyed.
Synthesizing this entire progression for the listener reveals a stunning, centuries-long trajectory.
It really does.
We started in the Renaissance, watching the intellectual center of gravity shift away from the glory of God to put humanity and human capability directly at the center of the universe.
From there, we watched John Locke and David Hume establish the rules of the new universe.
Demanding strict physical sensation and empirical proof for anything to be considered real, which plunged the world into skepticism.
Then Immanuel Kant stepped in, trying to save religion from the void by completely gutting it of the supernatural.
Reducing faith to a set of ethical behaviors.
Finally, G.W.F. Hegel took everything history, culture, and doctrine and threw it into the endless dialectic blender.
Turning concrete truth into evolving symbols. Every single step we trace today systematically stripped away the supernatural.
They built a philosophical universe where human reason sits on the throne and divine revelation is locked outside the gates.
As we start to wrap up, what should the listener take away from all this?
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final concept to mull over as we conclude.
Go ahead.
We have seen how placing human reason at the center of the universe dismantled the supernatural. But look closely at the final destination of this philosophical progression.
The end of the line with Hegel.
Right. If human reason and human experience are constantly evolving through Hegel's unending dialectic, if every truth we hold today is destined to become just a thesis that will be contradicted and synthesized away, what happens when our current synthesis of truth becomes obsolete tomorrow?
That is a chilling thought.
Does placing humanity at the center of the universe actually elevate us, or does it leave us with no solid ground to stand on at all?
When the sun of divine revelation is extinguished, the human mind might feel like it rules the solar system, but it is ruling in the dark.
That sums it up perfectly, ruling in the dark.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.